Now that you kind of dived into the autonomic nervous system by drawing a bunch of things that you probably aren't entirely sure about what's happening, let's talk about the big picture of what the autonomic nervous system actually is. The autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, consists of motor neurons that innervate smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. They make adjustments to ensure optimal support for body activities. And they always operate via subconscious control. Remember, it's called autonomic. So this is sometimes called the involuntary nervous system. Now, the two branches of the ANS are the sympathetic branch of the ANS, which would be considered like the gas, and the parasympathetic branch of the ANS, which would be kind of considered the brakes. That's a very large generalized overview of the thing. The problem is that it sort of gives you the idea that the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't do much, and that is actually not true. Let's actually talk about the parasympathetic nervous system first, because it is the one that is probably the least known. The parasympathetic nervous system, you can think of like the 3 Ds: digestion, diuresis, defecation. Diuresis is urination. Defecation is, well, you probably know what defecation is. So the idea behind the parasympathetic nervous system is that it promotes maintenance activities and it conserves your body's energy. These are all movements. These are things that are causing movements within the body. It's always a movement, and glandular secretions. It's the same thing. It's always something to do with muscle contractions, movements, or glandular secretions. Now, the typical example that we use for the parasympathetic nervous system is that it is most active when a person is relaxing and reading after a meal. Your blood pressure, your heart rate, your respiratory rate will be low. Your gastrointestinal tract activity is going to be high. Your pupils are going to be constricted. Your lenses are going to be accommodated for close vision. So go back to this picture and think about all of the parts of the body that the parasympathetic nervous system is innervating. You can see that it has connections, for example, with the eyes, right? And with the heart. It oftentimes is decreasing the heart rate. It decreases the lungs activity. But it increases when we have that arrow going to the abdominopelvic region, all those abdominal organs. It's actually usually going to be increasing their activity, increasing muscle contractions to move food on through, increasing secretions to make food digested properly. And all of these things are movements. Now, when we go through the sympathetic nervous system, this system is oftentimes a bit better known. It is well known to be the fight or flight system, but we're going to add to that. Just in the last few years, we've started adding another F: fight, flight, or freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze. This would be, for example, most active during exercise, excitement, emergency, and embarrassment. What happens when the sympathetic nervous system is activated is your heart rate increases. Your mouth is drained of its salivary fluids, therefore you might experience a dry mouth. You might have cold, sweaty skin. You might dilate your pupils. Again, take a look at the innervation from the sympathetic side and look at all these different organs where we have the eyes activated. The muscles of the eyes will be activated. We have the heart is going to be enhanced in its activity. The lungs are going to be enhanced in their activity. But when we go down to the abdominal region, oftentimes a lot of these digestive activities are going to be decreased. So we have sort of these opposing situations. During vigorous physical activity, you'll shunt blood or increase the delivery of blood to the skeletal muscles and to the heart, and you'll decrease the blood supply going, for example, to the very, very strong muscles of the stomach, so that your food, if you have a very full stomach, you might not be able to digest your food as well. Another thing that happens during vigorous physical activity is your bronchioles will be dilated. So you're going to be opening up your airways that go to the lungs. Now that you've gotten a good overview of the entire autonomic nervous system, it is time to zero in on the anatomical details of both branches. We're going to start off with sympathetic neurotransmitters, how they're released. We're going to look at representative neurons from each. You will still need a black, blue, and red marker. So we're going to draw a cross-section of the spinal cord in one specific area. Remember that the sympathetic neurotransmitters are only released from T1 through L2, the thoracolumbar region. Here's our spinal cord, and we're going to draw this little central canal for reference. And then what I'm drawing here is the gray matter. You notice that little jut sticking out to the side? That is called the lateral horn or the lateral gray column. It's special because the ANS is actually the only one that uses a lateral column. And what happens here is that those little cell bodies that we drew in the previous picture, we're going to draw them again, a little representation here. The lateral column is only used by the autonomic nervous system. So you'll only find a lateral column in T1 through L2 and then S2 through S4 for the parasympathetics. So the first thing we're drawing is a blue neuron, which we'll talk in a moment again. We'll remind you what it is in just a second. It's going to be going directly to this structure here, which is the adrenal medulla. These blue neurons that penetrate into the adrenal medulla, remember that this is a direct connection, and this is the only direct connection from the spinal cord into the ANS. Remember, only one neuron is needed here. It goes directly from the spinal cord, from that lateral horn there, from its cell body, directly into the adrenal medulla, and here we have the production of epinephrine and a small amount of norepinephrine as well. What's going to happen is there's a good blood supply that comes from the adrenal medulla, and that epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is a close cousin of epinephrine, is going to be released directly into the bloodstream, and a lot of it. Another word for epinephrine is adrenaline. Remember, adrenal medulla, adrenaline. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to be released upon stimulation by the sympathetic neurons here into the bloodstream. We're going to go ahead and draw two more cell bodies coming from this lateral horn. And these are preganglionic neurons. By the way, all three of these are preganglionic neurons. Even the one that goes to the adrenal medulla is considered a preganglionic neuron. Even though it doesn't have a postganglionic neuron, it's still classified as a preganglionic neuron. You can see I made a little error there and drew another Y, but we actually want to draw a dot there. So we draw short preganglionic neurons and a long postganglionic neuron. I haven't drawn the ganglion here, but you'll just have to, if you want to draw a little black circle around it to remind yourself it's in a ganglion, you certainly can. Now this particular one, it's blue and blue preganglionic, blue postganglionic. Remember that this is the special one that goes directly to the sweat glands. And here I finally remembered to label our adrenal gland in general and our adrenal medulla. Adrenal is a word that means on top of the kidneys. Adrenal. So this is a gland that sits right on top, just superior to the kidneys. All right, next we're going to draw a cell body. Our next postganglionic neuron would be everything else, would be targeting everything else. So the sweat glands are targeted by blue neurons, and all of your other targets of the sympathetic nervous system are targeted by the red neuron. And I did mention in the prior video, but let's go ahead and talk about what those are. Generally speaking, at least for the purposes of our class, it's a simple enough story to tell that a neuron only produces one neurotransmitter. It's not entirely true. Oftentimes they'll release a second modulatory neurotransmitter or neurohormone of some kind. But for the sake of our story, it's enough to say, if you're producing, a neuron only produces one thing. For example, a dopaminergic neuron produces dopamine, and that's what it releases at its synaptic cleft. A serotonergic neuron produces serotonin, and that is what it releases at its synaptic cleft. Therefore, a cholinergic neuron releases, pretty much the only thing it releases is acetylcholine, and an adrenergic neuron, pretty much the only thing it releases is norepinephrine. So first of all, we're going to go ahead and draw a little key here. The blue is called a cholinergic neuron. All of the blues that you see here are cholinergic neurons. And what a cholinergic neuron does is it produces and releases acetylcholine, abbreviated ACH. You can see I kind of ran out of paper there, but you get the idea. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that has various properties. It can be excitatory, it can be inhibitory, depending on the receptor. Next, in red, we have the adrenergic neurons. Adrenergic neurons. The adrenergic neurons produce and release noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine, and a small amount of adrenaline and or / epinephrine. And so we abbreviate acetylcholine as ACH. We abbreviate noradrenaline as NE. So we're going to go ahead and just label for the sake of labeling these things and making sure we really understand the lesson. Noradrenaline is released by an adrenergic neuron, and therefore I am drawing sort of close to the synaptic cleft there. If you have a neuron that produces a particular neurotransmitter, that is the thing that is released at its synaptic cleft. And of course, this also includes the cholinergic neurons that penetrate the adrenal medulla. Let's take a look at this as a whole, and maybe you want to toggle back and forth between this picture and the one we drew in the prior video, where you're thinking about looking at the autonomic nervous system as a whole, looking at the interaction from the spinal cord into the sympathetic targets. What you'll notice is that there is one special case where there is a single cholinergic neuron that penetrates the adrenal medulla, but causes the release of adrenaline or epinephrine. There are many examples of two neurons in a row, a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron. One special case of this is the sweat glands, which have a preganglionic cholinergic neuron and a postganglionic cholinergic neuron also. But most, I would say, other than these two exceptions of the adrenal glands and the sweat glands, everything else is a fairly straightforward story. You have a cholinergic neuron that is preganglionic. The postganglionic neuron releases norepinephrine. It is an adrenergic neuron that causes, look at the targets, right? Think about all of these interactions that are coming from the sympathetic side, coming directly out of the thoracolumbar regions of the spinal cord, and now you're starting to put more of a picture together. Now that we've discussed what the sympathetic nervous system does, you're going to start to look differently at these target organs and think perhaps more specifically about the role of these neurons and their neurotransmitters on the target organs. And then in the next video, we'll be discussing the receptors and really getting into the nitty-gritty of exactly how this system of the body works. Let's go ahead and draw our parasympathetic neurotransmitters. So we start off with drawing a structure of the brainstem. It's not a great representation, but it gives you the idea. There's the brainstem. Up above, we have the midbrain. In the middle is the pons, which is not involved in this story. And then down at the bottom is the medulla oblongata. We're going to draw 4 cell bodies, one coming from the midbrain. This neuron that leads from the midbrain would be passing through the cranial nerve 3 or the oculomotor nerve. And we're going to draw 3 representative cell bodies that are in the medulla. One of them would represent the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7. One of them would be the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9. And then the last one would be the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. Remember that we have a long preganglionic neuron, we have a short postganglionic neuron. Even if a ganglion is not actually drawn, you can assume that there is one there. There may be a very small ganglion, very close to the target organ, or it may be a dedicated ganglion. Now we're going to draw a cross-section of the spinal cord. The parts of the spinal cord that are involved here in the parasympathetic side are S2 and S4. Remember that we consider this to be the craniosacral branch of the ANS because the brainstem is involved. And then we have a portion of the sacral spinal nerves too, S2 through S4. Keep in mind that the cell body is part of that lateral horn, special to the ANS in general. Again, long preganglionic, short postganglionic. The ganglion is not drawn, but you can assume that it is there. You can certainly draw a black circle around these synapses to assure yourself that there is some sort of a ganglion there. We only have blues on this side. It's a little bit more straightforward in terms of release. We only have cholinergic neurons. Remember that cholinergic neurons produce acetylcholine. Therefore, at each of the synapses, we are going to draw acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the structure that is released at the ganglion itself, from the preganglionic neuron to the postganglionic neuron, and then from the postganglionic neuron onto the target tissues. And since the story is the same every time with the parasympathetic nervous system, there's really no reason to talk about specific examples. All of the targets are going to be effectors. We're simply going to draw the word effectors or targets, indicating that they are all affected. As far as the release of neurotransmitters, they are all affected exactly the same way. Now, if we go back to our overview of the nervous system, I want you to start to think about the fact that, gosh, that's weird. It's always the same neurotransmitter? But what we know about the parasympathetic nervous system is that it slows down the heart rate. It slows down the lung activity. It slows down your respiratory rate. But it speeds up a lot of what happens in the abdominal organs, such as enhancing your digestive activity, enhancing the production of urine, enhancing your defecation response, for example. How can it be that the same neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, has divergent effects? How can it be that it can sometimes be excitatory and sometimes be inhibitory? And if you are asking that question, I'm so proud of you, because it's a difficult question. But that means that you're getting at the idea of receptors. Neurons always work the same way. They produce a neurotransmitter. When they experience an action potential, they release that neurotransmitter, usually about 300 vesicles worth of neurotransmitter per action potential. How's that for a little trivia for you? But what about the reception? What about the target tissues? How do they actually receive that information? Well, that can be very different. So this is where we have to segue into our next topic, which is receptors. The same neurotransmitter can have different effects on targets depending on the receptors that that target has. So I've brought you along in this story in a way that I know that it has been overwhelming at times, but I'm trying to break it down into chunks that make more sense as we go along. We're really focusing in video 1 and video 2, we're really focusing on the idea of what the neurotransmitters are, how they are released, where they are released from, what do the neurons look like. Very general information about the targets, just this kind of list right down the center, and very general information about how the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems work. But now we have to think about those target organs themselves and how they receive those neurotransmitters, and that is entirely dependent on their receptors.